Murmansk, winter of 1944. The harbor reeked of salt and coal smoke as crates, tanks, and machinery lay scattered like broken bones across the icy docks. Amid the chaos, something immense and strange emerged through the fog, a black locomotive, its steel gleaming under a pale Arctic sun. The Soviet engineers froze at the sight. They had seen many trains in their lives, but never one like this. The American Baldwin steam locomotive stood taller than any they had built, its polished metal smooth as river stone, its rivets aligned with surgical precision. The serial plate read, "Baldwin Locomotive Works, Philadelphia, USA." Chief Engineer Yuri Antonov wiped his gloves against his coat and circled it slowly, his breath turning to vapor. He had spent a decade fighting with Soviet engines that rattled, leaked, and died under the endless punishment of the front. This one looked alive. "Comrade, this can't be real," muttered Alexei, his young assistant, tracing a finger along the massive wheels. "Where are the weld seams? It's too perfect." "It's real," Yuri said, crouching to inspect the underside. "And it's here to make us look like fools." Nearby, a Red Army officer barked orders as cranes lowered crates of spare parts, tools, and thick American manuals written in a language most of them couldn't read. The engineers exchanged glances, suspicion mixed with awe. The Allies had sent food, trucks, even boots. But this was something else entirely. A machine built not just for war, but for endurance. That night, as the port quieted and snow began to fall again, Yuri stood beside the silent locomotive, listening to the groaning of the frozen steel. He placed a gloved hand on its side and whispered, "Let's see if you're truly as good as they say." In that moment, the locomotive seemed to breathe, a sleeping giant, waiting to prove that the world could be built differently. At dawn, the harbor filled with steam. The American engine, nicknamed Black Thunder by the soldiers, stood ready on the frozen rail line, its tender stacked with coal from Kemerova and water tanks filled to the brim. A dozen Soviet engineers crowded around, notebooks in hand, each waiting to see if this foreign monster would even move in the Arctic cold. "Pressure steady at 200, called Yuri, squinting at the brass gauges. The dials moved with uncanny smoothness, no rattling, no freezing, no leaks. Every pipe was sealed as if built for another planet. He turned to Alexei. "Open the regulator halfway." The young assistant hesitated. "It's too quiet. Ours would already be hissing like snakes." "Do it," Yuri ordered. Alexei pulled the lever. The locomotive gave a deep, slow exhale, then roared to life. Steam billowed upward, black smoke curling into the morning sky. The train began to roll, its wheels gripping the rails with perfect rhythm. It moved as if it wanted to move. The other engineers cheered, laughing like schoolboys. Some even applauded, their breath turning to white mist. "It's alive!" one shouted. Yuri, however, remained still. His heart pounded, but he kept his face cold. He had seen too many miracles collapse after a few kilometers. Still, he couldn't ignore what he saw. No shaking, no screaming metal, no sudden drop in pressure. It was flawless. When the test run ended, the locomotive returned without a single loose bolt. The gauges held steady. The lubricants hadn't even thickened in the cold. Yuri climbed down and brushed a layer of soot from his gloves. "Not a single leak," he whispered. "How do they do it?" Alexei grinned. "Maybe they have better steel." Yuri shook his head slowly. "No. They just care about how the pieces fit together." As the sun sank behind the cranes, Yuri stared at the American machine still hissing quietly on the tracks. For the first time, he felt something unsettling, admiration mixed with shame. Days turned into weeks, and the American locomotive refused to falter. It ran on frozen rails, through snowstorms that swallowed men whole, hauling ammunition, fuel, and grain to the front without complaint. Where Soviet-built trains cracked and seized under the strain, this one kept moving, a heartbeat of iron that never skipped. Inside the maintenance shed, Yuri hunched over a thick, grease-stained manual printed in English. The pages were filled with elegant diagrams, precise, deliberate, almost artistic. He didn't understand all the words, but the drawings spoke their own language, the language of patience, symmetry, and care. Alexei entered, covered in soot. "We've pushed it for a week straight, Yuri. Still no failure." "None?" "None. The bearings are still smooth. The pistons sound like music." Yuri looked up from the manual, his face pale beneath the grime. "Music," he repeated softly. "Yes. That's what it is." He turned another page and saw the words tolerance, plus or minus 0.002 inches. His pencil slipped from his fingers. 0.002 of an inch. He could barely imagine a workshop in Moscow capable of such precision. "This is what separates us," he murmured. "Not ideology. Not steel. Precision." Later, as the night deepened, Yuri walked outside the shed. The Baldwin sat idling, a soft glow emanating from its firebox. Snowflakes melted as they touched the hot metal, hissing quietly like whispers. He placed his hand on the boiler again. "You don't belong here," he said. "And yet, you're exactly what we needed." Behind him, Alexei joined, clutching a mug of weak tea. "If the Americans can build this, what else can they build?" Yuri didn't answer. He was thinking of more than engines. He was thinking of a future that suddenly seemed closer, a world where machines didn't break every week, where work wasn't endless repair, where efficiency was not a dream but a standard. The fire inside the Baldwin flared, illuminating their faces. It was as if the machine was listening. The order came suddenly. A critical supply line had collapsed near the Kandalaksha front. Ammunition, medical kits, and rations were needed immediately. Every Soviet locomotive was frozen, broken, or buried in snow. Only one remained ready, the American Baldwin. Yuri stood beside the giant, its steel still warm from the day's work. "We'll run her tonight," he said, tightening his coat. 70 kilometers through ice and darkness. No stops." The other engineers exchanged uncertain glances. The route was treacherous, steep gradients, brittle rails, and temperatures that froze oil into stone. "Then we ride with you," Alexei said, climbing aboard before Yuri could object. The firebox door slammed shut, and the world turned red. Steam hissed through the cabin as the whistle screamed across the night. Slowly, the locomotive pulled forward, wheels crushing frost, pistons beating like drums. They plunged into the black wilderness, snow hammering the windshield, sparks trailing like comets. The wind roared through every seam, but the Baldwin didn't waver. Its fire glowed steady, its rhythm flawless. Inside the cab, Alexei fought to keep the gauges stable, while Yuri shoveled coal, sweat freezing on his forehead. Each kilometer was a victory against the cold, each turn a reminder of how fragile human life was compared to the machine that carried them. Hours passed. The countryside was a blur of snow and shadow. They crossed frozen rivers where the tracks cracked beneath the weight, bridges where a single mistake would mean death. And yet, through all of it, the Baldwin sang, its engine a deep, unbroken hum that drowned even the sound of fear. At dawn, they rolled into the forward depot. Soldiers ran alongside, shouting in disbelief. The supplies were intact. The train, still hot, still breathing. Yuri collapsed against the controls, his face covered in cold dust and frost. "She never even coughed," he said, laughing weakly. "Not once." Alexei looked out toward the rising sun. "Maybe that's what victory sounds like," he whispered. For the first time in months, the world felt alive again. The front officers didn't waste time. After the miraculous night run, orders came from Moscow. The Baldwin was to be pushed beyond limits. They wanted to see what this American marvel could truly withstand. For 3 weeks, it was driven relentlessly, hauling double loads, running through storms, climbing mountains where Soviet engines had failed and been left to rust. The locomotive's black skin turned gray with soot and ice, but it never faltered. Yuri's notebook filled with numbers, temperature readings, fuel consumption, piston pressure. Each page told the same story, no failures. The engine had become a legend among soldiers and engineers alike. Men came from distant depots just to see it. Some touched the wheels as if it were a relic, Others simply watched, silent, respectful. In a country used to improvisation and breakdowns, this machine was something foreign, dependable. One afternoon, while resting at a small station outside Kem, Yuri overheard two railway workers whispering near the water tower. "They say the Americans build them like this for every line," one said. "Even in peace." The other laughed bitterly. "Impossible. Nobody builds that carefully unless they have to." Yuri smiled faintly. He once would have agreed. But now he wasn't so sure. Maybe that was the difference. They didn't build to survive the war. They built to outlive it. As the days blurred, the Baldwin's whistle became a symbol. Soldiers saluted when they heard it. Villagers brought bread and milk to the crew when it passed. To them, it wasn't just an engine. It was proof that somewhere, far beyond the frozen front, there was a world where machines obeyed their makers and not the other way around. At night, Yuri stood by the glowing firebox and whispered to Alexei. "Ours rust. Theirs endures. And that endurance, that's power." Alexei nodded, eyes reflecting the flames. "If we can learn from it," he said softly, "maybe someday, we will build something that lasts too." The train exhaled gently, as if it agreed. By spring, the snow had begun to melt, leaving black rivers of mud snaking between the tracks. Supply trains thundered east and west, the war consuming more steel, coal, and men than anyone could count. Yet the Baldwin kept running. 3 months now, without a single breakdown. No burst valves. No seized pistons. It was as if the thing refused to die. But Yuri had begun to change. What once filled him with pride now stirred something uneasy inside him, a quiet, gnawing doubt. Late one evening, he sat in the engine shed, staring at the glowing coals inside the firebox. Alexei was asleep on a pile of rags, his face smeared with soot. Outside, the northern wind howled, rattling the corrugated walls. Yuri opened his worn journal and stared at his notes. Everything about the Baldwin was perfect, too perfect. How could something man-made be this flawless? He thought of the Soviet locomotives they had built before the war, crooked frames, uneven welds, sloppy tolerances, always rushed to meet quotas. They were products of exhaustion, not of craft. And suddenly, he wondered, was this machine a mirror, showing them what they could have been if they hadn't traded precision for speed, or dreams for survival? He picked up a small wrench and ran his fingers along the cold steel. "They build like they believe time belongs to them," he whispered. "We build like time is an enemy." In that moment, he realized something deeper than envy. The Baldwin wasn't just better engineered, it came from a different philosophy. Where Soviet design treated machines as tools of war, the Americans treated them like promises, each bolt tightened with the faith that peace would one day need it too. The fire crackled softly. The metal around him groaned like a living creature. Yuri closed his notebook, feeling smaller than he ever had before. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether he was studying a locomotive or a civilization. Summer came, and with it the long daylight of the north. The Baldwin now hauled supply lines deep into Karelia, where forests burned and bridges trembled under artillery echoes. It was no longer a novelty, it was indispensable. At every station, Soviet engineers gathered around it, sketching the design, measuring bolts, whispering in disbelief. They crawled under the chassis with flashlights and notebooks, trying to uncover its secrets. "Look at this!" one of them exclaimed, tapping the underside. "They use brass bearings instead of steel. That's why it doesn't seize in cold. And here," another added, "the boiler seams, they're triple riveted. We use single." Yuri watched them like a quiet guardian, both proud and ashamed. He knew they would try to copy it, but copying wasn't the same as understanding. The precision, the discipline, the invisible philosophy behind it, those couldn't be drawn on paper. One evening, as the locomotive rested by the depot, a delegation from Moscow arrived. Men in thick coats, their breaths smelling faintly of tobacco and suspicion. They questioned Yuri endlessly. "How long has it operated without maintenance? Could we reproduce it in Kolomna or Sverdlovsk? What metals are used in the pistons?" Yuri answered carefully. We can study it, yes. But to build it, he hesitated. We would have to change how we think. The officials exchanged glances. One leaned forward. Comrade Antonov, be cautious. We are not here to admire foreign machines. We are here to surpass them. Yuri nodded obediently, but something inside him recoiled. That night, he returned to the Baldwin alone. The station was silent except for the gentle drip of water from thawing pipes. He placed a hand on the warm steel and whispered, "They don't understand you. Not yet." The engine ticked softly as it cooled, like a living creature breathing in sleep. In that sound, Yuri felt both hope and a dangerous kind of longing. By autumn, the Baldwin was no longer just a machine, it was legend. Soldiers told stories of how it crossed burning bridges, how it pulled 6 Soviet engines out of snowdrifts, how it ran for half a year without a single breakdown. They called it the Immortal Train. But legends never stay still. Orders came from the Ministry of Transport. The locomotive was to be transferred south to haul supplies near Smolensk. Yuri and Alexei stood on the platform as the engineers from Moscow prepared it for departure. "She's not coming back, is she?" Alexei asked quietly. Yuri shook his head. "No. But maybe that's not the point." The engine hissed softly, a slow, heavy exhale like a sigh. Steam drifted into the amber light of evening, curling around them like a farewell. Its paint was worn now, its wheels caked with dust, yet it still looked proud, as if it knew its purpose. The Moscow engineers climbed aboard. Yuri stepped closer, resting his hand on the side of the boiler one last time. The metal was warm, almost alive. "You showed us what's possible," he murmured. "That's enough." The whistle blew, low, deep, mournful. As the Baldwin began to move, the platform trembled. Men saluted without command. Even the wind seemed to pause. The great machine rolled past, its smoke rising into the red sky, until only the echo of its rhythm remained. Yuri stood there long after it vanished, his hands blackened with soot, his heart strangely light. "Do you think we'll ever build one like it?" Alexei asked. Yuri smiled faintly. "One day. When we stop building for victory, and start building for forever." The rails gleamed under the fading sun, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere far away, the Baldwin's whistle cried again, distant, resolute, alive. And in that sound, Yuri heard the promise that machines could be more than tools of war. They could be testaments, to care, to patience, and to the simple, stubborn faith that not everything must break.